Hi folks, and welcome to this 7th daily critique where I'm going to be going through 5 photographs by Hamish Frost, who's a professional adventure sports photographer based in Scotland. I've actually done a few trips together with Hamish. He's a very accomplished photographer. I could sort of just dream of taking some of these shots, to be honest, because he's an accomplished climber as well. So the theme of this video is, I guess, going to be around more finessed edits and particularly looking for those odd flaws in your edit and finding a color neutral point with some of these particular images, because maybe there's some issues creeping in with blues and purples and so on. So a bit more of a meandering critique, this one, but let's get started. Okay, so we've got 5 pretty spectacular photos here. Not too much to critique, I have to say, because Hamish is very talented at what he does. But I will give it my best shot to at least review the images and pick out the few things that I would change myself. So this might be my favourite of the bunch. I love everything about this image. The key thing that strikes me is this amazing sense of perspective you get. All these diagonal lines coming through, so it really creates the idea that there's an abyss beneath this climber, and that falling would be a major error. So that's really great, and I love this negative space here too. This whole pool of white in the center of the image again just enhances that idea of the abyss. And actually, the way these cliffs all converge, to me, creates a sense that the climber is climbing out of a chasm of some kind. And I would imagine that's not quite the case, and Hamish probably doesn't get that impression when he looks at it. But that's certainly what occurs to me, and that makes the shots even more powerful. I would say that this blue at the top of the image slightly draws the eye. It's a bit stronger than I would choose, so the only change I would make to this image versus Hamish's edit is to just slightly desaturate this top portion of the image. So I'll just drag a gradient over there. So small change really, but it just helps to keep the eye focused on the climber there. But an absolutely stunning image, that one. Okay, so we've got another couple of climbers here. Just zoom in so we can see what's going on here. Great to have the snow spraying around. You can sort of really feel what it must be like to be doing this climb. Very atmospheric image. Again, I would kind of say that the color here is slightly distracting, and actually if we switch into Lightroom and just have a look at the original here, I think this colder white balance is actually better. I think if you start to warm up this cliff here and bring out some of the rock textures, I mean it tells a different story, which is, you know, look at the geology of the place and the climbers, I guess. But for me it detracts from the image, so I'd probably keep the white balance a bit more like it was in the original there, that colder feel. But another exciting image, and good to have this downward looking perspective, because it creates a sort of abstract sense as well, and we've got these same concepts of these diagonals creating a sense of perspective here, so all very effective in that respect. Okay, so we've got a downhill skier here skiing some ground that would be way too steep for me. I think this is probably a fairly difficult one to get the edit right on. The first thing that occurs to me is I guess I'd just like it to be a bit brighter. And when I do brighten images up, I try to push the brightest highlights as bright as they possibly can to allow me to lift the shadows as well, if that makes any sense. So I'll just quickly have a crack at this in Photoshop. In Lightroom, I haven't actually had a go at this yet. So I may or may not be successful. So here's the original, slightly colder white balance. So 5,700 Kelvin is already pretty warm, so I'd probably keep it even a little bit colder than that. And then I'm going to boost the shadows and crush the highlights. So this will sort of rebalance the image, so to speak. I'm going to add some contrast, and then I'm going to lift the brightness as much as I can to get these areas on the left as bright as they'll go without clipping. And you can see we don't actually have any of the halo-y type effects that we had in the in Hamish's edit there, and I would remove the chromatic aberration because there's a bit appearing on that edge, and then I would crop. So I'd get rid of most of this this sky here, but I quite like having an excess of the slope, so do something like that. In fact, maybe let's just have that slope coming out the corner nice and tidy like that. Yeah, and we'll lose some of that messy snow at the bottom. So actually quite a simple edit that, and you could even try and brighten this right hand side and just play around with getting this as nice and airy as you possibly can. That to me, I think I prefer that of the two. So if I just compare the two there, so much better color in this one because of the warmer white balance, and you could always choose to do that warmer white balance, but the key for me here is just lifting the brightness a bit, because I just think it makes the image a little bit more engaging, and certainly makes the you know, the coat and the backpack and so on the skier a bit more noticeable. So slightly different approach there, but another great shot. Okay, now this one's a bit more of a struggle to edit correctly, and I think Hamish has done a pretty great job, to be honest. If we look at the, I mean, clearly the focus here is this figure, and we want him, oh, that's a bad circle, we want him to stand out as much as possible. And if you look at the original, then you'll see that the figure starts to disappear into the background, because tonally it's relatively flat. So what Hamish has done, roughly speaking, is to try to separate this foreground from the background, and he's done that by adding contrast and brightness, and then maybe adding some blacks in here. So this is kind of the tonal balance that he's starting to go for, but you can see that the runner still starts to get too bright, and so he's locally made that runner darker by painting an adjustment over him there. So you can kind of see that helps the runner to stand out, but yeah, difficult one to edit. I think Hamish has actually introduced a slightly red cast here, so I'd probably keep it a bit more on that blue side, and you can see that the tint is plus 24, which is quite magenta, so I'd effectively bring in a bit more green. But yeah, really difficult to edit that one perfectly, and I think Hamish has done a good job. So finally, we're going to talk about this image. Let's have a look at it in Photoshop. Very non-classical composition, but a very effective composition. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you are not supposed to do here. I mean, you've got a 50-50 split. You've got two climbers, not the perfect three. And maybe there's no obvious place for the eye to rest other than the figures themselves, and yet it all comes together perfectly for me. I love this half and half, the sort of the reality of the rock wall versus the beauty of the views. That sort of yeah, that contrast of those two ideas, and of course this layering with the hoarfrost on the rocks is absolutely stunning. I mean, we shouldn't use Game of Thrones analogies, but this is very much the wall from Game of Thrones, isn't it? And yeah, very, very exciting image, and great to have the climbers in those very bright colours with the rocks in such a view just totally monotone, black and white. And that's one of the points of critique, actually, is that I think these aren't quite neutral, the colours in here. In fact, if I just saturate everything, you'll start to see it's a bit purpley, the blue. So one of the things I'd like to do is just make that more neutral. Also, you can see a halo on the rock here. So that's a detail issue that I personally find quite distracting with this edit, that I would want to avoid at all costs, because it separates the background from the foreground even more than the shot does already. So let's edit the raw file. Let's go back into grid mode and pop this out. Okay, so you can see that the mountain there in the background is a lot less visible, and to bring that back in we need to both darken it and add contrast. But the first thing I'm going to do is just do something globally. So I'm going to darken the highlights and boost the shadows like I usually do, and then add some contrast to correct for that flatness. And then I'm going to create a gradient tool here, and I'm going to drag it so that it's affecting mostly this left hand side, and I'm going to darken and I'm going to add contrast. Now I've got to be careful what's happening to the rocks here, because we don't want this area to get too dark, and if it does we can actually just come in with a brush and just correct that that darkest portion here, just so that it more tonally matches this this area on the right. So just rebalancing that there. So we've got less of a halo apparent now. Oops. And I'm just going to make that a bit softer still. And then I'm going to paint in some contrast manually over the hill here. So I'm just painting the area generally first. If you want to know where it's painted, you can do a really crazy adjustment like that. So just want to make sure that I've got all of that hill, and I'm going to add contrast and adjust the exposure so that the rocks stand out more, but we don't get a halo around the top of the mountain. So I'm just going to brighten as I go, I think there. And then I'm going to desaturate. You can see that there's been color introduced. There's blues coming in here that weren't there before. So I'm going to reduce the saturation there. And perhaps this looks a tiny bit too bright compared to the sky. So actually I'm going to bring back that brightness again. And just going back and forth and looking very carefully at the effect it's having. So that to me is looking pretty good, and obviously we can do the dust spot removal here, because those are quite distracting, so let's get rid of those. Okay, and then lastly I'm just going to actually darken this edge here to completely eliminate any sense of that halo, because I still think there's just the slightest idea of it coming through. So I'm just going to very, very slightly darken that area. So literally 0.1 of a stop, nothing really, but enough to completely shut down any idea that there's a halo there. And if you did want to add more contrast, you can of course do that. So let's just try darkening and adding a bit more contrast here. Yeah, so that's okay, but maybe just change the rotation there and just soften it out a bit more. Something like that. So we've got rid of the halo. We don't want to introduce color that wasn't there, and I think that's pretty great. Last of all, I just want to help the climbers here stand out a bit more, really make those colors pop. So I'm just going to add the tiniest bit of exposure, being careful not to affect the background snow too much. So I'm just darkening the highlights whilst boosting the exposure. Maybe make them a tiny bit warmer and add in some saturation. And the same with this gentleman down here. And I think that is where I would stop. So not a huge difference here between the two edits, but enough to get rid of that halo. And why my computer is struggling with this, I have no idea, but it is. There we go. Okay, well it's given us a crop, but at least you can compare the halo there. So there's my edit, no halo at all, and there's Hamish's. Very small detail issue, but that kind of thing for certain viewers might be slightly distracting. So it's important to keep an eye on those details. And of course I've brightened the climbers here just to help them stand out. But really enjoyed editing those and giving my thoughts, Hamish. Fantastic shots. I sort of feel a bit bad critiquing them at all, but there you go. And I hope you found that helpful.